So today we're going to talk about optimal transfer programs. So we've been talking about optimal taxation. As I talked about, you can think about transfer programs as fitting in with the optimal tax literature, but to some extent they don't, because some characteristics of transfer programs are non-standard, as I'll talk about today. So in practice, we have many types of transfer programs in the US, each of which can be thought of as being justified by a different theory and a different set of assumptions. So I'm going to talk about 4 different types of transfer programs that we have and talk about the theory behind each of them. So the first is just the negative income tax, which is the standard Murley's model. It basically tells you that you want to have a negative income tax. That comes out of standard optimal tax theory. So as we saw, you want to, typically in the optimal Murleysian tax schedule, calculated to match various elasticities and so forth, you end up giving a large lump sum grant to low-income individuals, which is then quickly taxed away as you have this phase out of that grant, right? So just from a qualitative point of view, what's the benefit of that approach? No one is omitted in the sense that you target the benefit at really the people who have the highest marginal utility of consumption, the poorest people in the economy. You have low administrative costs relative to other types of programs that I will talk about, where you're just paying cash, right? It's just like administering the tax system. There's no additional like public housing or food stamps or other stuff that you have to deal with. And there's no stigma. I mean, there's, you're paying taxes, you're receiving benefits. There's no special notion of, additional stigma from receiving this type of cash transfer per se. Unlike, say, receiving food stamps or receiving a particular, living in public housing, where you might think there is stigma associated with that people bear a utility cost from getting that transfer. The cost of this type of program, as we've seen, is that you generate excess burden. You generate an efficiency cost by distorting incentives to work, especially for low-income households. So if you're basically facing a marginal tax rate, like we saw in the Saez simulations of 70% or something at the very bottom, then you really create a strong disincentive to enter the labor force for low-income people. So that's one option, which we have had historically, and we have some of even today. And many countries use that type of system. A second very different option is the earned income tax credit. That is the subsidy for work for low-income individuals. And here the relevant theoretical model that we're going to talk about is the paper by Emmanuel Saez and QJE in 2002, where, again, at a high level, what are the benefits and what are the costs? The benefits are that you create a bigger incentive to work at the low end of the income distribution, which in the context of the Murley's model is not necessarily a good thing because you don't want to distort incentives the other way. But in the Saez model, where you have extensive margin responses, it actually does end up being a good thing for reasons we'll talk about. And like these cash transfers, it also has low administrative costs. The costs are two. First, you are going to generate an efficiency cost even with the EITC because you have to phase that out at a higher income level, and so you're going to distort incentives there. And second, you're not targeting the most needy, right? You're targeting the guys who are getting like $10,000 of income, not the guys who are getting zero. And if you think the people who are earning zero have higher social marginal welfare weights, then that's problematic. Or, it's not as desirable from that perspective. So you can see why the EITC might not be as good from a redistribution point of view. 2 other types of programs, which are different in that they're not pure cash transfers, are categorical anti-poverty programs. So these are programs that are conditioned on a particular type rather than purely being a function of your earnings. So a classic example, which is something we do in the US, is assistance for the blind, where on your tax form you get a special credit if you're blind. And there are many, many other programs that have this type of property, right? So I think vision, health type of conditions are particularly clear examples of what are called tags, like things that distinguish your earnings ability. But we have various other programs, say, targeted at single women with kids, other types of tags. And what's the logic of that? Abstractly, the logic is that tagging reduces incentive constraints by tying the tax rate to immutable qualities. So if you take the extreme example of disabilities or health conditions, you know ex ante that that person might have a lower earnings ability than someone else. And so rather than conditioning the transfer on the level of income, which generates distortions, here by conditioning it on the immutable tag, you are able to do more redistribution without generating as much inefficiency, right? Because you're not distorting any behavior. If you think health conditions are not endogenous to the tax system, which seems plausible for most things, then you're not generating any distortions in behavior. The costs are that, of course, that's not always feasible. So there are lots of lower income people who might not have an obvious tag that makes it clear ex ante that they would be low income. And as a result, you're going to have pretty limited coverage with these types of things as a redistributionist policy. And then the fourth option broadly are in-kind transfers. So the first three all use money. So they give you cash conditioned on various things, income or other characteristics. The fourth one is just to give benefits. So food stamps, public housing are the classic examples. What's the benefit? You, as we'll talk about at the, a little bit later, you can generate efficiency gains, again, by relaxing incentive constraints, because you can exploit the fact that there might be differential valuations of these in-kind transfers for high and low types, and you can exploit that to make transfers more efficiently. The costs are that, A, you have to pick what goods you fund. So you have to take kind of a paternalistic stance. Why should the government be picking what it helps people buy as opposed to letting people pick? And second, here you do generate kind of an administrative cost or an inefficient ordeal cost. So what you're really exploiting is that you create a hassle, essentially, to be involved in these programs, because cash is always more efficient because people can replicate whatever you're providing, right? So you make the system more inefficient in order to discriminate across types. But that obviously in and of itself has a direct cost, that you're inefficiently forcing people to consume certain types of food or live in a particular public housing project where they might not want to live, et cetera. And so there's both an admin cost and a utility cost from that. Okay, so we'll talk about each of these programs in turn, and then you'll see more concretely in the context of a theoretical model how these qualitative trade-offs emerge. Okay, questions? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, usually for goods, we think, well, how does the government actually provide this stuff? It's not that the government is literally building this at a lower cost. They're hiring a contractor who's then going to, produce a private market contractor who's going to build this thing. I think the kind of thing you're describing is more plausible in like insurance markets, for example, where private provision might end up being more costly because of adverse selection type issues or competition leading to kind of inefficient waste on marketing, things like that. But typically for things like food or public housing, I don't think that's a standard argument. Okay, so let's go through each of the four things sequentially. So the Murley's model, optimal transfers negative income tax. I'm going to be very brief because we've already covered that logic. So as I've said, the Murley's model predicts that the optimal transfer at the bottom takes the form of a negative income tax. That is a lump sum grant for those with no earnings, and then high marginal tax rates at the bottom to phase out the lump sum grant quickly. That system ends up being optimal because it targets the transfers to the most needy. Now, the Murley's result that you want to have a big grant and then only have positive income tax rates, right? Not have subsidies for work, is critically predicated on the assumption that individuals are at an interior optimum in their choice of labor supply. So what I mean by that is we have no extensive margin responses where when tax rates go up, people drop out of the labor force or enter the labor force, right? You only have everybody choosing some interior number of hours where, one way to think about it is the marginal disutility of work for the first hour of work is extremely low. So everybody's going to end up working like at least 1 or 2 hours. And so then when I change tax rates by a little bit, at the very bottom, somebody's going to go from 1 hour to 3 hours or 1 hour to 4 hours. But in practice, what we end up seeing in the data is that participation responses are actually pretty important. Because it's not very easy to find a job where you can work, 3 hours a week, right? So what you end up seeing is a bunch of people will go from 0 to 20 like part-time work, or even 0 to 40. And that behavior, A, is inconsistent with the assumptions of the standard Murley's model, because you're choosing labor supply continuously. So it suggests there's like an indivisibility in labor supply choice. And B, what I will show you here, the Saez paper, is that it really affects this result that you want to have positive marginal tax rates. So there are a series of papers, Diamond, Saez, and Laroque, who incorporate such extensive labor supply responses into the optimal income tax model. So the way you want to think about this is standard Murleysian objective function and basic structure, but the labor supply model is going to have discrete choice rather than a continuous choice of hours. Or another way to think about it is that they're fixed costs of work. Okay, so like you have to drive to work or something, so it's not worth it to drive and work for 1 hour, so you're going to end up working like a minimum number of hours conditional on entering. And that's going to generate a discrete extensive margin response. Either way, the point is you have basically, these rigid choices. And so the way I'm going to model it here, the simplest version, is where you have fixed job packages where you cannot smoothly choose earnings. So there are like 10 different jobs that you can choose which offer different levels of hours and earnings, but you can't continuously vary between those. So let's let the earnings outcomes that you can pick be denoted by W0 to WL. Okay, W0 we're going to normalize. We're going to say that's the zero earnings outcome where you don't work. Okay, you have a wage of W0, and then W1, W2, etc. are other earnings levels that you could choose. The tax system in this discrete model, if you have 10 different jobs, it's going to be defined by 10 different numbers, right? The size of the transfer, the tax that you pay at each of those values. So it's a discrete tax system, a vector. Let's let TI denote the size of the tax or transfer when earning WI, so that your consumption is given by WI minus TI when you have job I. We are going to assume that you make a pure participation choice, and this is crucial. So an individual of skill I compares CI and C0 when deciding whether to work, but can't choose any of the other jobs. So the way to think about this is like you get some training, and so let's say one person is a plumber, another person is a teacher, another person is a doctor. The doctor cannot become the teacher, the doctor can't become the plumber, but everybody can choose whether to work or not. That's what the model is, okay? So if you have a participation tax rate of tau I, so let's let tau I denote the participation tax rate, then we can think of CI minus C0 as being WI times 1 minus tau I. It's saying, if there were no taxes, I would get an extra WI from taking job I, but I'm only getting WI times 1 minus tau I, right? So tau I denotes the participation tax rate, which we had defined in the previous lecture. And in the aggregate, so fraction HI of the population earns WI. So let's let HI denote the fraction of guys who have job I, and just, those fractions are going to sum to 1, right? We define the participation elasticity as the impact of an increase in the value of job I, which could come from, say, reducing the tax on job I, on the fraction of guys who have job I. So that's the extensive marginal elasticity. How does the fraction of people who are working as doctors vary in percentage terms with respect to the wage rate for doctors? So in this case, similar structure to the Murley's model, but discretized. So the social welfare function is summarized by social marginal welfare weights at each earnings level, which I'm going to call little g sub I. So rather than this function, capital G, that we had before, there's going to be a little gi associated with each earnings level. And we're going to assume no income effects. So we're going to have the weighted average of these social marginal welfare weights equal to the value of the public good at the optimum. Same reasoning that I described in the last lecture. I can either give $1 to everyone or use that dollar to fund the public good. So if I'm optimizing at the government and I normalize the value of the public good to be 1, this condition has to be true. Okay? The main result of the Saez model is that work subsidies, such as the EITC, are optimal in this environment. So in particular, you want to have t prime of z less than 0 if you had a continuous schedule. Or to state it in the discretized model, you want to have a lower tax liability for job 1, the lowest paying job, than job 0. You actually want to make the guys who are earning $5,000 pay less taxes than the guys who are earning 0. So I'm going to show you that result first in the purely discrete model, and then we'll talk about why it applies in the more general case where you have both intensive and extensive margin responses. In the general model, what you need is that the responses have to be concentrated primarily along the extensive margin. So the generic version of this result, it requires two things. First, extensive margin elasticities have to be big relative to the intensive margin. So one way to think about that is you basically need to be closer to this discrete version of the model than the standard Murley's pure continuous choice model. And it'll become clear why that's the requirement in a second. Second, you need that the social marginal welfare weight on the low-skilled workers, that is people who are actually earning some money, that has to be greater than 1. Okay, so what that means is, you know, the overall social welfare weight's average to 1, right? But you need that it's not the case that the guys who are earning 0 are the ones with very high social marginal welfare weights and everybody else has a very low marginal welfare weight. You actually need to put some value on redistribution to people who are earning $5,000 or $10,000 and not just 0. And that seems like a plausible condition, right? It's not that we care only about the people literally making 0. Those are not the only guys we're interested in redistributing to. So this is, I think, the key assumption in this model, which we'll come to. Okay, so before I get into the math, I want to give you the intuition for this result, which is actually really simple when you step back from the math of it. So suppose you take a case where there are two types, doctors who have a wage of, say, WH, and plumbers who have a wage of WL, less than WH. Both, as I was saying, can choose whether to work or not, but doctors cannot become plumbers. So let's consider two different options. Suppose we transfer money to the people who are earning 0 income, all right? So within each of these types, there are going to be some set of individuals who choose not to work. There are going to be plumbers with relatively high disutilities of labor, and there are going to be doctors with relatively high disutilities of labor. So if I transfer money, as the Murley's model suggests, to people who have 0 income, I'm going to help, let's say, the low-skilled plumbers who choose not to work and have really no resources, right? So that's beneficial from that point of view. But, and here's the crucial thing, I end up distorting the doctor's incentive to work as a result, right? Because now I've made the transfer bigger for people who have 0 earnings. And so as a result, the doctor who's on the margin deciding whether to work or not might decide to quit when I give a bigger transfer to 0 income people because his net wage has fallen. In contrast, if I transfer money to people who have an income of WL, that is to working plumbers, then I still help these relatively low income plumbers, but I do not distort the doctor's incentives, right? Because by construction, the way we've set up the model, the doctor cannot choose to become a plumber because it's now more attractive to be a plumber. The only thing the doctor is able to do is go to 0. And so when I transfer money to the guy who's earning some positive amount, I end up helping people who I want to help, relatively low income guys, but I don't distort behavior as much because the high type can't pretend to be the working low type. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So you're saying in the first case, if I transfer to the 0 income individuals, I distort the doctor's incentive?
Yes.
They may prefer not to work?
Yes. Yes. No, but there's always an optimality condition, right? So there's a distribution of, let's say, marginal utilities or a distribution of disutilities of work. And so, you know, like take a secondary earner who, let's say, has kids and may decide to work or may not decide to work, depending upon the wage. If you tax that person a lot or give them a big transfer if they don't work, they may decide, it's not worth it for me to work. So there's still going to be an extensive margin decision at each income level. I think that's plausible, and we do see that in the data. it helps. So no, so there are going to be, I should have been clearer here, there are going to be some plumbers who are not working, right? And likewise, there are going to be some doctors who are not working. So within each of these types, imagine that there's a distribution of disutilities of labor. So some set of guys, you know, they decide they don't want to work because there's a really high cost of work, right? So some of these people might have disabilities or something like that. So it helps that subset of people. Yeah.
I was just wondering how it is not also distort plumbers' decisions.
Transfer to zero income individuals? Yes. But the point is it distorts the incentives of the doctors as well. The key difference between these two things is that if you transfer to zero and transfer to WL, in both cases you're helping relatively low income guys. But this transfer does not distort the high skilled types decision, whereas the transfer at zero does distort the high skilled types decision.
In the Merle's model, there's no heterogeneity in terms of preferences. Everyone has the same taste for working and not
Yes.
working. And so here we're both changing that and we're changing the extent
Yeah.
versus the incentive.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. You need both of those because otherwise you're going to be in this case where every plumber is working or every plumber is not. So you need two dimensions in order to make the model smooth. That's right. Any other questions? Yeah.
Why do we have to assume that they're separated in their choices? Is there no way you can just take out some incentive constraints and then take either one out?
You need, so this is like a very simplified version, right, where we just make bias, like there's an infinite cost of becoming the other guy, all right? But the more general version of this is that I can make both an intensive and extensive margin choice, but if the intensive margin elasticity is very small, which basically means that the cost of changing my labor supply on the intensive margin is quite high, then I end up getting a result like what I'm going to show you. So you don't need to go to this limiting case. It's just easiest to understand the intuition in this case. Another question?
Back to Pascal's question, the heterogeneity disability need not be, the distribution need not be different across the types.
No. That's actually not that important. All you need is you're making the model smooth by having that heterogeneity, so that when you change these policies, not everybody. You don't want to have a discrete, you don't want to have jumps in the model, right? You want the thing to be differentiable. So usually you introduce some heterogeneity when you have extensive margin choice, so that when you change a policy, the fraction of people who are working changes smoothly, so that it doesn't jump from 0 to 1. So whether the two distributions are the same or different, that's not crucial for doctors and plumbers. Okay? All right, so because of this logic, it's better to have a larger transfer to WL than to 0 actually in this environment, provided that the social marginal welfare weight on guys who are earning WL is sufficiently large, right? If you don't value transferring to guys who are making $5,000, then this doesn't make any sense. And so what does that mean? It effectively means you want to have a subsidy for work because you're providing a bigger transfer to people earning 10,000 than to people earning 0 in a continuous version of the tax schedule. That means you have a negative marginal tax rate, right? That's what the EITC is. So just to state it differently, in a pure extensive margin model, the transfer T1 only distorts the behavior of type 1, the plumbers in this example. Higher types do not move down, unlike in the Merle's model, where if I had a big transfer for the guys earning 10,000, I would distort behavior above that point. But a transfer T0 distorts the behavior of all types on the extensive margin. So let's now derive a formula. Let's see this result mathematically. And let's derive a formula for optimal tax rates and the optimal EITC in some sense in this discrete model. So as usual, we're going to do this using a perturbation argument. So we're going to think about a small tax cut DTI on job I, which means that we're going to raise consumption for job I by minus DTI greater than 0. That's going to have 3 effects, which are familiar, the 3 standard effects, a fiscal effect, a welfare effect, and a behavioral effect. So I'll talk through the math, but I want to toggle back and forth with this graph here, which shows you what this perturbation looks like. Okay, so suppose I have a case where I'm starting out with a tax schedule that looks like this. Okay, so anytime the slope of this line is above the 45-degree line, that's what the EITC is, right? We have a negative marginal tax rate. We're providing a subsidy. So in this case, we have a subsidy, and then the slope falls below the 45-degree line, so we have a tax beyond that point. So let's consider a perturbation where for job 1, we increase consumption by a small amount, okay? What effects does that have? That has a fiscal effect, which is that I just have to pay the guys who are earning that amount, that money. So if there are H1 guys earning, working at job 1, and I'm giving them an extra $1, I lose H1 dollars, right, from the government's point of view. I also have a welfare effect, which is going to be positive, which is those guys value the money at some amount G1, which I've assumed is greater than 1. And so that ends up being a gain to them, the direct mechanical gain to them. We're giving more money to these low-income plumbers, right? And then there's the third effect, which is the behavioral response, which is the fact that now that I've increased the subsidy here, a bunch of guys are going to jump from here to job 1. Job 1 has now become more attractive, so a bunch of people decide to start working. And that ends up having a cost to me because I'm providing the subsidy. The size of that cost is given by the amount of the transfer that I'm providing to job 1, which is W1 times tau 1, the participation tax rate, times the size of that behavioral response, which is going to be related to the extensive marginal elasticity, right? Notice that the key thing that's different here relative to the Murley's model is that in the Murley's model, when I do this deviation, I'd have a bunch of guys coming down this way. They'd be reducing their earnings when I make job 1 more attractive. So a bunch of people who were at 11,000 are now going to start earning 10,000 because 10,000 looks more attractive. That is the key effect that has been shut down here. Or in the more general version where we don't shut it down, we assume that it's small, or we argue that it's small relative to this effect, and that's how you end up getting the EITC being optimal. Okay, so let's go back to the algebraic version. So we talked about the fiscal effect. We talked about the welfare effect. For the welfare effect, there's an envelope condition in the background that we're not talking about explicitly, right? So when you change the tax rate, a bunch of people are going to switch. It's exactly what we saw with the behavioral response. A bunch of people are going to switch how much they work as a result of the tax reform, right? But we don't need to worry about that to first order because there's an analog. It's not an envelope condition at the individual level because this is a discrete model. But at the aggregate, I showed you that in discrete choice models, it works the same way. The marginal guy who switches in doesn't get a first order gain from the switch because he was essentially indifferent before. And so mathematically, that ends up dropping out, okay? So to first order, the welfare effect is just given by that. And then there's this behavioral effect, which is related to the extensive marginal elasticity, which we saw, and we can rewrite, as depending upon the difference in transfers between the ith job and the 0 job. And so then it ends up being the elasticity times the fraction of guys at that level times the size of the tax change multiplied by these terms to get it in elasticity form. As in any perturbation argument, at the optimum, the sum of these three effects will be 0. And then you do the algebra, and you end up getting this formula for the optimal tax rate, which looks like an inverse elasticity rule, very familiar. Tau over 1 minus tau equals 1 over the elasticity times 1 minus GI. So if GI is greater than 1, that second assumption that I mentioned, that means that tau 1 minus tau 0, T1 minus T0 is less than 0. That is, the tax rate is negative. That is, you want to provide a work subsidy. Okay, so you see mathematically the result that we just talked about following that intuition. Okay, you want to provide a bigger transfer for type 1 than for type 0. Okay, so we extend the model to allow both intensive and extensive responses. Okay, so here we are now going to allow the higher types to switch to lower jobs as is reasonable, right? And so the way this is going to work is there's some fixed cost for entering the labor force, which is going to generate extensive margin responses, okay? But then you can make an intensive margin choice. You can choose whatever hours you want, just like in the Murley's model, all right? In that model, there are going to be both intensive and extensive margin responses to a tax change. When I raise tax rates, some people are going to choose to work fewer hours, and some people are going to choose to drop out, all right? And so what Emmanuel shows in the paper is that the general formula for optimal tax rates is going to be messier in this environment, but it's a function of both intensive and extensive marginal elasticities, okay, as you'd expect. Think of it as like if you're in the pure extensive margin model, then it's just the extensive elasticity that matters. If you're in the pure Murley's model, it's only the intensive elasticity that matters. And then it's a weighted average of those two models, basically, right? You get this general formula, which I'm not going to go through here in the interest of time, and that can be calibrated using empirical estimates of the intensive and extensive marginal elasticities, which is going to be the next thing we talk about in the class, how we estimate these two elasticities. Just to show you how this works, let's take an example. So this is a case where epsilon h and epsilon l, they denote the intensive marginal elasticities, okay? Elasticity of hours of work with respect to tax rates for the high and low types. We assume that these are 0.25, roughly consistent with empirical evidence. And then we vary the extensive marginal elasticity. What that means is what fraction of people drop out when you raise tax rates by 1%. And consider three cases. Eta equals 0, shown by the dashed line, is the pure Murley's model. No extensive margin responses. And as you'd expect, you get exactly the negative income tax. You get a big transfer of $10,000 to guys earning 0, very high marginal tax rates. Look at how flat this dashed line looks relative to the 45-degree line. And then that continues. So you have no EITC. You have eta of 0.5. Now you see an EITC starts to emerge, where this slope is actually above the 45-degree line. It's especially clear when you go to eta equals 1, where now you see the slope is much above the 45-degree line initially, and the initial transfer is only 5K, and then it gets phased out. So as you make the extensive marginal elasticity bigger, holding fixed the intensive elasticity, you want to have more and more of the EITC shape. Following exactly the logic we described. You're getting these guys to enter the labor force, and you're transferring money to sort of the deserving poor here who are earning small amounts of money without generating a big distortion of pulling people down. Whereas if you transferred money down here with the 10K grant, when you had an eta of 1, you'd get a bunch of these guys quitting, a bunch of the high-income guys quitting, which you don't want, right? So I think this is a very interesting rationale for the EITC, and it's mathematically coherent. But intuitively, when you think about the political debate, I think there are also other rationales for why we actually have the EITC, which come back to the social welfare function. So I think aside from this somewhat sophisticated argument about extensive and intensive margin responses, I think many people have the view that I'm happy to give money to this guy, but not to this guy. And I want my tax dollars to go to somebody who is making an effort, but I'm not willing to have my tax dollars go to somebody who's just sitting at home. And that is, of course, a totally different rationale for having this type of program. It's like a workfare view of the world, which hasn't been developed as much in the literature, and I think is kind of interesting to think about.
This data is just applied across the board.
We're assuming constant elasticities. They need not be constant. For the low incomes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. And in fact, that's what you find empirically. Like I think this, Mithra, is related to your question. You wouldn't expect that many doctors to quit completely when tax rates go up by a little bit. At lower income levels, you might expect people to quit. That's right. Okay, any questions on this? Okay, so now we're going to move on to the other types. So we've talked about two types of transfer programs, right? Murleysian negative income tax and EITC. So we're going to move in a slightly different direction. So in a very famous paper in 1978, Akerlof describes the concept of tagging. So in the standard Murley's model, we've assumed that T of Z depends only on earnings Z. The size of the tax you pay or transfer you get depends only on earnings. In reality, government can actually observe many other characteristics beyond your earnings. So and these characteristics might be correlated with ability. And so you can set a policy that is T of Z comma X, where X could be things like your gender, your race, your age, your disabilities, family structure, height, any number of other things, okay? There are two major results in the Akerlof paper and the subsequent literature, which are straightforward, once you understand the logic. First, if the characteristic x is immutable. Immutable means there's no way you can change it, okay? So take something like a health condition that you have no control over, we'd call that immutable. But other tags that we use, like the number of kids you have, that's not immutable. You can, first of all, there can be fertility impacts of tax policies, which people have studied. Second, you can have kind of evasion type of responses where you pretend that somebody else is taking care of the kids. Especially for divorced parents, there's this issue of who claims the kids and so forth. So that's not an immutable characteristic. Okay. So if you have an immutable characteristic, then you want redistribution across people who have different values of this characteristic x to be complete. So what that means is you want the average social marginal welfare weights to be equated across these different groups. So the idea is if I know that person 1 has some disability and person 2 does not, I'm not distorting behavior at all. So under the Merleesian objective function, I might as well equate those two guys' incomes, right? Because I'm not going to create any distortion if I equate their incomes. More generally, if I have heterogeneity in multiple dimensions, and this is one dimension in which I have heterogeneity, this disability, I want to equate the average social marginal utilities across these two groups, because there's no value in having differences in their average incomes given that I'm not generating any distortions. It's like I'm back in that very first model we talked about, which was the Merle's model where labor supply was not a function of the tax rate. It's essentially like that. Okay? If the characteristic x can be manipulated and x is correlated with ability, then taxes are going to depend upon both x and z. So this is kind of like the intermediate case, where I want to take advantage of this tag a little bit because there's a first order benefit to doing that. So I want to give a tax break, say, to people with kids if I know that they have higher marginal utilities of consumption. But I don't want to go all the way because then I'm going to generate a lot of inefficiency. Okay, so that's like the intermediate case. So there's some interesting conceptual issues that people have been talking about recently with whether this model really makes sense from a practical point of view. So I want to talk about that. So we do a lot of tagging, right? And I think the intuition is very sensible, that you want to exploit the IC constraints in this way. But there are other tags that we don't exploit, and this is highlighted in this recent paper by Mankiw and Weinzierl, where they point out quite clearly that there are certain tags that we choose not to use. So take, for instance, height, being tall versus short. As we've, I think, talked about before, we know from the data that there's an observable premium associated with being taller. Every extra inch is worth about a 2% earnings raise. So, what's important is it doesn't matter why that is, right? From the perspective of optimal taxation, there could be various theories for why that is, and that is actually debated in empirical literature, whether it's something about nutrition or actual value of height or confidence or, God knows what else. But it's irrelevant from the optimal tax point of view because height is not going to respond to tax changes. Okay, you would hope not. And so that's an immutable tag. Okay, so what they show you is that it's actually quite valuable to tax height. The average social marginal welfare weight is lower for tall than short because of the earnings difference. And so you want to make a lump sum transfer from tall people to short people up to the point where G bar T equals G bar S. And so they do this calculation. They calibrate this, and they say that the average tall person should pay $4,500 more in tax than the average short person. Okay? So what they're trying to get at is, there's potentially quite a bit of social welfare value from imposing these types of taxes, but clearly we don't, and we think it would be kind of weird if we did. Okay? So what they want to do with that example is argue that it challenges the validity of the basic framework. So, if you get this result, conditional on a set of assumptions, it must be that something is off about the set of assumptions you're making, right? Or something's wrong with the theory. So what is the model missing? So there are two things, at least, in my view, there are two things that are important. One is that people have strong interest in horizontal equity. Okay, so the idea that two people earning the same amount who have different characteristics that we think don't directly bear on their earnings should be treated the same way. So there seems to be this strong notion that we should not treat two people who are basically in the same position in very different ways. And horizontal equity, literally interpreted, goes strongly against tagging, right? Horizontal equity says we should just make things a function of income. If you manage to earn a high income despite overcoming a big disability and some other guy just got lucky and earned a high income, the idea of horizontal equity is it shouldn't matter kind of how you got there. We should treat people equally given their actual ex post situation. So I think this is not built into the standard model, but there's some notion that this is important. The second thing, which is harder to deal with, but I think is actually probably pretty important, is that while we're happy to tag on disabilities like blindness, I think nobody would have a problem with giving tax break to people who have visual impairment. Here, I think the problem is it's not obvious why height is related to earnings, or it's related to what you were saying, that height plays any causal role in determining your earnings, right? And so this is just, this is more of a conjecture. There's no formal result here. My sense is that in practice, tags are used primarily when we think they're causally related to the ability to earn, like disability status, or to welfare. So things like family structure, we kind of understand that if you have a lot of kids, there might be more value in money for such families or people who have large medical expenses and so forth. So what I take away from the Mankiw-Weinzierl sort of critique is that there's some argument for using the standard Murley's analysis that is just T of z instead of T of z comma x, even when you have access to these x's for certain types of x's. But what's nebulous is which types of x's are acceptable tags and which are not. And that's like an interesting theoretical question to figure out. Okay, so that's tagging. And so then now we're going to talk about the last thing, which is in-kind redistribution. So this paper, the original paper here is due to Nichols and Zeckhauser in '82. So in the first best full information model, there's no reason to make an in-kind transfer. There's no reason to give a person a thing when you can just give them money and they can go buy that thing. So what's the logic? An in-kind transfer is if it's tradable at the market price, right? So if I can sell you my food stamps dollar for dollar, then I might as well just give you cash because it's equivalent to cash. And if it's non-tradable, like I can't sell you my food stamps, I can only sell you 70 cents on the dollar or something like that, then it's just inferior to cash, right? There's no way it's going to be better than cash, aside from the issues we were talking about earlier about more efficient production. So Nichols and Zeckhauser argue that there's a potential rationale for in-kind transfers in Murley's type models where you have informational constraints once you have heterogeneity in preferences. Okay, so the idea is that if you have heterogeneity in preferences, you might be able to relax the IC constraints using in-kind transfers. Okay, so let's take a concrete example of why you might want to have in-kind transfers. So the key idea is that there are going to be hassle costs associated with consuming these in-kind transfers. So let's say you have a soup kitchen that provides free soup, free food as an in-kind transfer policy, okay? Let's let S denote the amount of soup you get and W the weight in minutes that you have to incur in order to get the soup, to wait in the queue. So this is what's going to be different, I think, from the consumption tax. The consumption tax doesn't directly entail a hassle cost, which is what you're using with these policies to relax the constraints. Okay, so you have two types of agents, poor and rich, and they have different utility functions. Both of their utility functions are increasing in the amount of food they consume and decreasing in the amount they have to wait in line because they could be working or something at that time. But they have different marginal utilities. The poor guys, they put more weight on getting more food. They have a higher marginal utility of consumption. But they have a lower disutility of waiting in line because their opportunity cost of time is lower. The rich guys, they're the reverse. Their utility function is S minus W. Okay? So social welfare, just assume a utilitarian criteria, and we just add up the utilities of these two types. So consider two policies. A cash transfer, that basically the way to think about the cash transfer tax policy is that you have no weight. I'm just giving you money. You can go to some store. You can buy soup. There's no hassle involved, all right? So if I have a total of $100, let's say, to spend on this program, I have $100 in soup to give away and no wait times, the soup is going to get split equally between the two agents because they're both going to show up at the soup kitchen and wait in line to get this. And let's say essentially for some reason it's very efficient. I've eliminated the hassle. Nobody has to wait. Both guys show up. They both get the soup. Assume they split it equally in that case because there are an equal number of both types. That's going to give you a utility of 100 for the poor guys and 50 for the rich guys, right? And so social welfare is going to be 150. It's equivalent to a cash transfer program that pays each guy $50 and he goes and buys this amount of soup. Yeah.
So why do you say that they both get the same utility from the soup? Like they actually have to work on food.
No. So they both get the same amount of soup, but he's getting 2S utility and he's getting S. So both are getting 50 units of the soup, right? So he gets 100 utility and he gets 50. The rich guy gets 50 and the poor guy gets 100.
But shouldn't the poor guys get 2/3 of the soup and the rich guys get 1/3?
Oh, you mean in the allocation?
Yeah.
So no, the way I want to think about it is, so you're saying why do they split the soup equally?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's a different policy, right? What I want you to compare this with is I want to basically use this as an approximation to a cash transfer where we just divide. So the idea is that I cannot distinguish between these two types, right? That's the key assumption. So in the cash transfer, I can't. If I could condition it on you being poor and rich, then the problem would be much simpler. Right? That's like the tagging case. Then I just give all the money to the poor, so I don't have a problem. Okay, so now suppose I introduce the hassle. This is where I'm deviating from the standard tax system. I impose a wait time of 51 minutes, just to create this inefficiency, in order to do this discrimination. Okay, so what's going to happen? The rich guy is going to leave because it's not worth it for him to hang around and get $50 in food and wait for 51 minutes in line because he gets a net utility of -1 from that. And the poor guy, as a result, ends up getting all of the soup. And so his utility becomes 200 minus 25.5 because his disutility of waiting in line was 0.5 times the amount of time. And so his utility is 174.5. So total social welfare is now 174.5, which is greater than 150, the amount that I got from the cash transfer, right? So effectively, I'm targeting the transfer more effectively to the needy guy by creating this hassle that makes the higher income guy not show up.
So practically, how do you think of these hassle costs? Just having to turn in paperwork or?
So that's one view. No. But so I think the other way to think about it is like public housing. You're not going to want, like higher income people, even if they could live in public housing, just might find it uncomfortable or unpleasant or whatever, like they would rather live somewhere else, right? Whereas the lower income people are willing to put up with it, and that's going to produce this effect, right? Okay, so targeting gains outweigh the efficiency losses from the ordeal in this particular example. Obviously, that need not be true in general. But the general result is that you might want to create some ordeals potentially from a screening point of view in order to improve efficiency. Now, related to what you were asking about paperwork, I think there's an interesting dichotomy between this view, which is totally neoclassical, and the behavioral view, which is when you impose ordeals, you actually might screen out the wrong guys. So if I have a lot of paperwork, I make it hard to claim the EITC, claim unemployment benefits, et cetera. What I might end up, the favorable view from this model is only the guys who really need that transfer are going to figure it all out and sign up for the program. The other view, which I think is actually quite important, is that the types who you're trying to help the most have the hardest time figuring it out, right? And they end up not claiming the benefit. So understanding who is being screened out with these ordeals and tags is very interesting and something that we don't know much about empirically, actually. So I think papers that look at variation in the size of these ordeals and who ends up getting selected into the program, that's like a really interesting thing to figure out. Yeah. Okay. So that, I think, is all I have to say about transfers. I want to make one more note about this topic, and then we're going to move on to the labor supply part of the class. So An important assumption in the Murley's model and all the variants of the Murley's model that we've talked about is that there's no ex post uncertainty. So once your skill type is revealed, like you're the high or low type, you control your income perfectly. Whereas in practice, that's surely not the case because there's considerable ex post uncertainty. There are a lot of shocks that people face, like unemployment, health, whatever, that end up affecting their income, right? And so in that case, the right way to think about a progressive income tax is not just that it provides insurance behind the veil of ignorance, which is what the Murley's model is about, providing insurance against which type you might end up being, but that it provides insurance against ex post shocks as well. So one way to think about the EITC is that it's not just that it's giving transfers to low-skilled people, but that it's helping buffer your income in times when you lose your job and your income falls into that EITC range. You get a bit of a boost, right? It helps you smooth your consumption as you face these shocks. And as usual, you have a trade-off when you look at it from that perspective between insurance and moral hazard. You don't want 100% insurance even with these ex post shocks. Suppose they were only ex post shocks, because that would generate a lot of moral hazard because you would want to be unemployed if you got a big transfer, right? Every time you lost your job. But some insurance is going to be desirable if people are risk averse, ex post, over these income fluctuations. So just so you're aware of this part of the literature, there is a well-known paper by Varian in 1980 that thinks about optimal income taxation from this perspective instead of the Murleysian perspective. So thinking about tax policy as insurance, rather ex post insurance rather than ex ante behind the veil of ignorance insurance as in the Murley's model. So let's just quickly talk about how this works. So here your income Z is given by E, effort, plus epsilon, where epsilon is random noise. The government, importantly, only observes Z. It doesn't observe effort. So that's the information problem in this context. And it sets a tax schedule based on Z, just like in the Murley's model. The individual has a utility function that depends upon consumption minus effort. But now, because we have ex post risk, we take an expectation. So it's an expected utility model. We take an expectation over that epsilon distribution. You choose E to maximize your utility. So this is standard. Individuals optimizing given the government system. Effort E is going to be low if the tax schedule is very redistributive. The government, so that's the moral hazard problem, right? So the government is going to choose the tax schedule T to maximize indirect utility, indirect expected utility. And that's going to create this trade-off between insurance and incentives. What you can actually show is that there's a close connection between the Murleysian model in terms of the parameters that matter and the Varian model. So the optimal tax system ends up depending on parameters that are very similar to the Murley's model. That is, the impact of changes in taxes on the level of effort, the marginal value of transferring to different guys, which is going to be given by the ex post marginal utilities of consumption, and so forth and so on. So why has the Varian model received less attention than the Murley's model? I think one important reason, which is an abstract conceptual issue when thinking about social insurance, is that it's not obvious that the government is any better than the private market in providing such insurance, unless you introduce other issues, which we'll talk about in the social insurance part of the class, like market failures. So in the Murley's model, okay, where you effectively have adverse selection, only the government can improve redistributive outcomes once skills are revealed to agents. So the way to think about this is, suppose you're born and it's known, who the high types are, who the low types are, who has disabilities, and so on. Once that information is known, nobody's going to want to trade, right? There's no scope for an insurance market to develop. So you have to have the government that kind of forces you into this insurance contract before your type is revealed. Whereas if it's about ex post risk, you could imagine that you have some stochastic output, I have some stochastic output. We sign a contract that says if I end up doing well and you end up doing poorly, I give you money, and vice versa. Such private insurance markets exist in practice. It's not obvious why government can do that any better than anybody in the private sector. And so in a pure moral hazard model, which is what the Varian model is, with ex post information revelation, private markets should in principle reach the optimum themselves abstracting from various issues that we're going to talk about in the social insurance part of the class. And so in practice, we do in fact see that, right? So firms offer wage contracts that provide insurance against bad luck. So you see things like tenure provisions, like for teachers or at universities, or you see, severance payments when you lose your job. There are actually private sector arrangements to deal with this type of risk. And so that's why this, I think, approach is discussed more in the context of social insurance markets, where there are particular things that the government insures, like health or disability, where we think the private market may not be functioning properly. So we'll treat that separately.